was no evidence that Mr. Noriega was involved in drugs, no hard evidence until we indicted him.
Does the NSA collect any type of data at all on millions or hundreds of millions of Americans?
No, sir.
It does not.
Not wittingly.
Have we ever tried to meddle in other countries' elections?
Oh, probably, but it was for the good of the system.
Oh, we don't mess around other people's elections, Joe?
All right, welcome to another episode of the Rackets Podcast. I think this is going to be a really interesting episode here. The main topic of what I'm going to cover today is really the influence of money in politics and how there's a certain economic class of citizens who seem to get really all of the influence, and it really goes contrary to what our elected officials are supposed to do. All right, so on this topic, there's a particular episode of 60 Minutes that's always stuck out in my mind. It was aired about 10 years ago, and it was a segment talking about how several, or really most of the elected officials up on Capitol Hill, they spend the majority of their time raising money for the next campaign, for themselves and for their party, right? And they really operate, many of them operate just like a telemarketer. They're hitting the phone, but they're not calling your average working class person. They're calling the really wealthy elite individuals, the kind of people who really can spread the kind of money around that make a real difference as far as their election campaign. So I'm going to show you one particular example. It's going to kind of go around in a lot of different directions, but in the end, I think it's really going to illustrate a lot about how our system actually works. So here's this particular person. I hope I'm pronouncing the name right, Arun Agarwal, and he's a really wealthy Dallas businessman. He's an Indian American who has a lot of influence. So if you see here, here's one donation back in 2021 to the governor of Texas, Greg Abbott, for $25,000. And he makes, several others. That's for $1,000 there for Lance Gooden, he's the state representative. And there are multiple of these types of, almost 7,500, another 3,500 for the governor, right? So and it keeps going on and on, a lot of these types of big money donations. So when you're throwing money around like that, when you pick up the phone and you call up your elected representative, you're going to get a very captive audience, right? So one of the things that I want to point to is there's a whole lot of quid pro quo with this. And you might think that that's illegal, but really most of this stuff is actually perfectly legal, right? So here we have an example where a very wealthy donor helped to get, Governor Greg Abbott put into office, right? In turn, and again, I don't think that there was necessarily an agreement made for those types of donations, but there's just we kind of understand how all this stuff works, right? So Arun Agarwal, he gets appointed, and he's had a number of different roles with the Texas Economic Development Corporation as the head of their board of directors. And he's had a number of different roles with that organization, right? So one of the things that he's done in that role is he's helped to provide travel expenses. So the governor gets to go, and he's gone multiple times for this economic conference in India, right? So if you look right here, that's Agarwal right there in the background of this picture. And you probably don't recognize the main person there. So that's the governor there. And Agarwal, sorry, not Agarwal. That's Gautam Adani. Again, if you don't know that name, it's understandable, but he's one of the wealthiest people in the world. He's from India. He's this energy giant as far as the industry. But he's also a really shady businessman, for the lack of a better term. The current administration under Modi, you could really just sort of call him sort of a crony capitalist. His wealth has exploded ever since the Modi administration started. I mean, and it's pretty obvious the attachment there. So when Modi first went into office, I'm talking about the Indian Prime Minister. He was seen, flying on the private jet of Adani, and again, his wealth has exploded exponentially. A whole lot of favorable deals, a lot of rumors about bribery and corruption. Nothing really concrete, but a lot of shady dealings, right? So here's this person who's again got this really wealthy background, kind of questionable, beginnings as to how all this money was made. Was it entirely on the up and up? But here we have it, right? So we've got the governor of Texas. This was all paid by this donor. This sort of cycle of quid pro quo, right? So Adani has been in the sort of figurative crosshairs of particularly of the Biden administration. They've been very aggressive in trying to weaken Modi's power in the region. And Adani is essentially like he's joined at the hips with the Indian Prime Minister, right? So his success goes along with Modi's success. And again, there's just been a lot of these different types of what you would call attacks. So there was this short seller that put out this report and it crashed the value of the Adani Group stock. Now it recovered entirely. So that, again, these were really more based upon rumors and emotions. But there's been a lot of these different things that I'm going to get into in a second, right? But I just kind of really wanted to give you really a picture of Adani, right? To kind of get a little bit better understanding of where I'm going with this story. So back in September of last year, there was a whistleblower who created this news story that showed how this nearly $2 billion airport deal that the Adani Group was going to do with the Kenyan government had all kinds of corrupt background, really wasn't going to benefit the Kenyan people. And the story went pretty much viral in their country, and it ended up killing the deal, right? Again, I'm just trying to kind of establish a little bit of a pattern here that he has, again, in my opinion, a pretty darn shady businessman, right? So that's September of 2024. And then this was just after, November of 2024, Adani puts out this tweet and he gives sort of this vague promise that he's going to invest $10 billion in the US energy sector and create 15,000 jobs. So I would love it if this was actually true. The problem is that, again, I've got, hindsight is 2020, but well, a week later, after he sends out that tweet, the US DOJ presses charges against his company. And I'm using that term, his company. One of the things, I'm not quite knowledgeable enough to understand this. As you can see, he's named in the indictment along with his family and other members of his company. But I guess apparently that's what his lawyers have really stuck to, that he actually hasn't been charged. And he's charged with the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Long story short, I mean, it's just basically he's accused of using bribery to gain a government contract in India as an Indian company. And you might pause there because, I mean, and that is a normal, just kind of a hesitation there, right? You're like thinking, why is the US DOJ pressing charges against an Indian man involved in, potentially corrupt practices in India? Well, this law really has been weaponized for years, by the US DOJ. It's part of how we do try to gain some influence. I mean, I'm very much an anti-corruption person. There's a lot of merit to those laws, but there is also a lot of hypocrisy, right? As far as how this is enforced. One of the things you might be wondering was, well, how the heck can the United States even press charges like that? The long story short, if your companies have connections with the US financial system, this is the way that we can press these types of charges and many others, levy sanctions, etc. I don't know how accurate these are. Again, that's just an indictment. But again, there is that pattern. There's a ton of rumors. The way that he's acquired wealth, it just absolutely looks like crony capitalism, right? So you might be wondering, where am I going with this whole story, right? So November, he gets, Adani, he gets these charges, by the U.S. or his company does a week beforehand. The reason why I mentioned a week beforehand is, again, I'm entirely speculating here, but somebody who's a multi-billionaire, I think his net worth is somewhere around $60 billion. I find it hard to believe didn't get at least a little bit of a hint that, hey, the U.S. is pretty serious this time. They're going to press charges against you. I really doubt that blindsided him. So the reason I bring that up is because what's happened is, and this is really the way that our media cycle works, is a story like this, there were a ton of headlines about this. Reuters, major newspapers, they printed stories just based upon this with absolutely no details, right? So Adani gets to sort of dangle this carrot of, hey, I could bring you guys this $10 billion in foreign investment, $15,000 in jobs. The reason why I'm skeptical about it is because I haven't seen a single US company actually come forward and say, like, how this is jeopardizing, these DOJ charges are jeopardizing this deal. When you're talking about $10 billion of investments, there's all types of people, if this was concrete, who should be stepping forward, who should be furious about this, right? And there hasn't been a single person to step forward. So I've always kind of assumed that there's a high level of BS to this. I don't really believe that there was a concrete plan in place to invest $10 billion in the United States, when, again, at least under the Biden administration, the Trump administration seemed to be a lot more friendly with Modi than the Biden administration was. So, I mean, there's probably some truth that at least he wanted to explore that. But again, I'm highly skeptical. Again, not a single US company stepping forward to say how mad they are about this, because, I mean, that would have a dramatic effect on their outcome if the US government is stepping in and doing things like that and pressing these charges, right? So the charges get pressed in November of last year. In January, there's a US Congressman, Lance Gooden, who, if you remember, we were looking at earlier, who's received these campaign donations from Arun Agarwal, the same person, again, in this meeting here, right back here, meeting with, arranging these meetings for Adani. Now he goes and he writes a letter in the lame duck session to the Attorney General Merrick Garland, questioning these charges. Again, and I'm not really disputing what he has to say, because I'm also not a fan of what does look to be very politically motivated charges. And I'm going to go a little bit more into that, as far as, the aggression, these acts of really foreign policy, and basically weaponizing the DOJ. But long story short, what I really want you to understand is that really how all this is working, right? So in January, he creates this letter, right? And it's not the United States press that gets the scoop and releases this. This scoop with the actual letter is released by NDTV. That is a news station that is owned by Adani. He owns, if I remember, he actually owns pretty large stakes in multiple media companies. But just like here in the US, once one news organization prints an article, it creates the cascading effect. Everyone refers back to that original article, and it creates, again, this cascading effect. And think about it from a public relations standpoint. Again, no one in the US is printing this, right? But in India, where he's really trying to protect his public image, he's got a US congressman going out of his way to challenge this case with the Attorney General. And all it takes is one. You've got now a public relations win for you. And again, it creates the cascading effect. So one of the things that you might be wondering is, and that's why I kind of wanted to link to here, was FARA cases, the Foreign Agents Registrations Act, because it would be a crime if Gooden was receiving money directly, receiving compensation directly from Adani, and not being registered as a foreign agent, right? Like, this is an actual crime. You can't do that. There have been several, government officials, lobbyists, et cetera, who've done these types of things, and they've been thrown in prison. So you're allowed to do all of this type of lobbying work for a foreign entity, but you do have to disclose it. It's that simple. You have to disclose it, right? And I'm not accusing him of that, because we've seen, like, this is pretty obvious. It's pretty transparent. Let me go back to donations. Here we go. And there's multiple, right? He's received all this money from an American citizen who, again, has a lot of money to throw around and gets a lot of influence, right? But it's important to know that, again, that this FARA law, it's been in place. It's an important law because, again, these types of things should be disclosed. And I've linked to this particular op-ed piece. I think that this is really one of the best examples of the power of avoiding these FARA laws, right? So back in 2016, right after the election, General Michael Flynn wrote this op-ed piece in The Hill talking about how Turkey is in crisis and it needs our support. And he's pointing to someone who I would really just describe him as a CIA asset. We could spend a whole episode just on Gulen, but basically he was highly involved in a coup against the Erdogan regime in Turkey, right? So think about this. Put yourself back in this time period. You're reading this op-ed. There's this former general talking about how we've got to support this person, and he's making a case. I'm not really gonna. I mean, I don't know. It's a tough question, right? Because basically, the argument he's making there is we can't allow this CIA asset to continue doing so. And I wouldn't argue against that. Here's the problem that I have, and that's why I wanted you to understand the purpose of that law, is let's go down to the bottom of the article, right? Hold on, I'm getting there. So this was essentially the disclosure when it came around the first time. Then you see the editor's note. It says, on March of 2017, 4 months after this was published, Michael Flynn published those documents showing that he earned $530,000 lobbying on behalf of the Turkish government. And he did not disclose that to the editors at that time. That's a really important disclosure. So a little context, as you probably remember or might not, Michael Flynn got into trouble with the FBI. They were trying to wrap him up as part of the whole Russiagate thing, and this was part of that discovery. As part of that investigation. But I kind of wanted to put that aside. But I really, in my opinion, I think this is a really good example of why these foreign governments and why these foreign business people do these types of things, because it has a tremendous influence. $500,000 to some, really corrupt government or corrupt business person, that's a drop in the bucket of if they can get a really sympathetic audience with the United States government, right? So I just kind of want to go back to, let's go back to Adani here, right? So one of the things, and part of why I really wanted to give this example, and what really pisses me off about this example, is the fact that, okay, you see Lance Gooden, he's writing this letter to the Attorney General challenging this case. There's nothing wrong with that. My problem with it is on multiple fronts. A, I think that this was essentially written by those lobbyists. I'm going to go into that in a second. But B, it's the fact that you're not really willing to put your name on this. And what I mean by that is you can follow his social media page. This is a person who's highly opinionated. He's more than happy to put his opinions out there and let you know how he feels about issues. You can see these different press releases. I mean, they're quite frequent. But if you notice, absolutely no mentioning to the letter that he created to the Attorney General questioning that case. So in my opinion, you're not really operating really as a representative of the United States. You are essentially doing public relations work, PR work for very wealthy foreign businessman who has all kinds of scandals attached to his name. And you're collecting a pretty massive salary to be a US congressman and represent the people in your state, right? So yeah, that's an example that really pisses me off, right? So one of the things, and here's sort of like again, because he's not creating a press release. So this is why I have to go through like these backward sources to get to the actual details of the letter. He's not putting his name on it, right? So in the Indian press, you get little drips and drabs. Here I've kind of found the actual text of this letter. And what really irritates me as well is, again, he is essentially repeating the talking points of these Adani-owned media sources. And just like how here in the US, you get a story, you get all your talking heads up on the screen, they're all repeating the same bullet points. Well, guess what? That's what he's doing here in this letter. One of the things that he does point to is asking about whether this was funded by George Soros. I'm going to get into that really in a second. I think it's a really oversimplified argument that's made there. So I genuinely question, because for the Republican right, George Soros is a legitimate boogeyman. He helps to put these super liberal prosecutors in place. He helps to fund several of these different civil society organizations that are really counter to a strong Republican agenda. And I can understand. I totally understand why Republicans would have a major issue with George Soros domestically. Where I take issue is when we look at the way George Soros, the State Department, USA, the way that these entities work, they're all working in conjunction. And to try to frame something like how it does look like our US DOJ was weaponized in this case, to parse it in very partisan terms, you're just not really understanding of how US policy, foreign policy works, right? So I'm going to point to an example. This is one of my latest articles. So the United States was heavily involved in a coup last year that helped to remove a very pro-India leader in Bangladesh, Sheikh Hassani, and we installed this super US-friendly, former Nobel Prize-winning economist. In other words, a very US-friendly, helped us to install this type of a leader into Bangladesh. So this was, again, another part of this coordinated strategy by the Biden administration to really try to weaken India's influence in the region. And this was, again, part of it. You can look this over. There's some really interesting stuff there where, the head of the State Department, the US ambassador to Bangladesh, he, like, within a couple of days of leaving office, he goes and he leaves and he joins a US Texas oil company that happens to be very prominent there in Bangladesh. He's part of, the negotiations, and really US energy policy in that country has dramatically shifted now that we've, helped to remove a very strong India ally there. There seems to be, and again, it's not concrete, but there seems to be rumblings that, there might be a military base that's placed there. And again, I'll kind of go into this, trying to keep this all relatively short. Again, you can read that on your own. But as I mentioned before, essentially a lot of what Gooden is doing there, he's really repeating sort of the talking points of the Modi lobbyists. And if you notice, one of the things that if you start to follow the news in India, again, Modi, that's Modi right there, and Adani, they really are essentially joined at the hip, right? The BJP, that's Modi's party, right? This is a really good thread. And again, a lot of times when we look at these types of things, there's always that grain of truth. And that's why I really want to acknowledge it. But where I really take issue with this is when we've got a US congressperson who certainly seems to be being steered by very wealthy individuals and again, doesn't want to put his name on it, who's really just acting as a PR person for these really wealthy individuals, right? So this thread, which I'm gonna include in the show notes, definitely worth looking into. And it really does show how the United States and a lot of these different, I guess we'll say, like US or American oligarchs are really trying to infringe upon their influence in the region. And one of the things that they point to, and I don't disagree in any way, are some of these reports that came out that really, hurt the reputation of the Adani Group. And it was written by the OCCRP, the organization. I forgot exactly what that stands for. Basically, for organized crime. I forgot what the OCCRP, what that acronym stands for. And basically pointing out that the OCCRP really is very close to the United States government. So one of the things that you'll notice, like if you look at my website, I link to several investigations that are printed by their organization. I think they do really good work. With that said, it doesn't mean that there isn't sort of a US government agenda. So what I mean by that is they'll do really good investigative work, but it's usually, again, someone who is a country that is not a strong US ally. So they're doing this essential oppositional research. They point out, and again, that's really good quality work. And I don't really find work where by the OCCRP that I would say that is untruthful. They do these really good, really detailed investigations. They probably receive some leaks from US intelligence. They do really good work. So it doesn't mean that what they're publishing isn't truthful, but you have to understand that there is a little bit of an agenda behind it. So that's, this was a really, in my opinion, a really important article. Came out again December of last year, that points out that the OCCRP, again, this by Drop Site News, this was I think a really good investigation, because a lot of people had really suspected that link, that between OCCRP and the US government, but this really helped to really crystallize that and point out that yes, they do get a pretty large percentage of their budget, from the US government. Again, at the end of the day, it doesn't negate what they have to say, but when you see these types of investigations and it's really shining a light on the countries that really aren't aligned with the US empire, for the lack of a better term, it's important to have that context, right? So I tweeted about this particular example. One of the things that I was pretty sure about was in that interim period was that I thought that the incoming Trump administration was going to help out Adani. And in part, it's because Donald Trump for years has always said that he felt that the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, basically the law that outlaws bribery, is unfair to US interests. It's just horrible, right? Like, do we want to go back to the Stone Age where all business is conducted that way? But that is something that he believes in. He's been pretty vocal about that for a long time. It's something that I'm probably going to do another episode or another article specifically just on that. But the reason that I brought it up is because if you think about it, right, well, you've got this new Trump administration coming in, and Adani has these charges looming over his head. It would sure be a nice carrot if the two of them could come to some kind of an agreement and the Trump administration were to drop the charges. So I was thinking kind of small scale. I assumed that the charges would just get dropped, right? That they would, that there would be some sort of press clip that the Adani Group is going to promise certain levels of economic development, America first, that type of narrative. And, most everyone involved would consider that a win, right? Well, I was wrong in that I just assumed that particular case would get dropped. Well, guess what? February last month, Trump goes ahead and he makes this executive order, and he says they're going to put a moratorium on all of these investigations. So not just the Adani case, I think it was for a full year. They're saying we're just not going to move forward with these cases because, in his words, they're going to restore the competitiveness and security of the United States. So, yeah, I'm kind of a little bit speechless there on that one. We're basically going to legalize corruption and bribery. That's not really the move forward. It's not the way that we really want to advance our interests, right? So let's think about that. So we're now in February, right? Again, so it looks like Adani, he's going to be able to, not have to face any charges. But I wanted to kind of give you guys some more context. Well, again, how does stuff like this happen? Well, I don't know if you've got an extra $100,000, sitting around that's just disposable income for you. But when you have a $60 billion net worth, that you can get a whole lot of ROI, return on your investment. So this report here by the Financial Times said, and they're just looking at those disclosures again, because I'm not accusing them of anything illegal. It's perfectly legal to do this type of foreign lobbying. It just has to be disclosed. And when they're going over those disclosures, they found that his company spent about $130,000. Guess what? In my opinion, that's a tremendous ROI. Like you see how the wheels of justice and how our American system can really be pushed around with in a larger term. Like that's not a lot of money in the bigger picture, but just how big of an influence it can have if you know the right people. If you know the right people in DC, you can make a lot of things happen, right? So again, getting back to when Lance Gooden writes that letter, he doesn't have to receive the money directly from that foreign entity. If there is that cutout, there's nothing illegal about it. I just think it's highly unethical. And I think that I'm assuming you probably agree with me, right? So that's why I wanted to bring your attention to, well, one day after Trump decides they're going to put the moratorium on the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, there's another leak in India. Again, within the media within India, not the US press. This is not a story that these representatives are putting their name on and getting behind. But now, remember, we had the lame duck session there with Garrick Marland. Now we have a new attorney general in Pam Bondi. And now there are 6 lawmakers who have written a letter strongly objecting to the case against Adani, right? They're putting their support behind this, sort of privately. Again, they are not putting what I mean by they're not putting their names on it. And here are those 6 men. Again, it's Lance Gooden again. But when we go and we look at these people and we look at their social media, we look at their press releases, not a hint, not a word that they're using their time, that they're using their resources to essentially do public relations for an ungodly wealthy foreign individual who's got all kinds of rumors of corruption and bribery associated with his name, right? They look here, not a hint of it, no reference. Once again, no reference. And if you're looking at these names, this is not exactly the A-list of representatives, right? One of them, he doesn't have any mention of that, but he does have this press release about it. He wants to create a bill to put Trump's face on the $100 bill. But yeah, as we go through the list of these guys, none of them, no mention of this letter, this strongly written letter that, yes, their name is on it in the letter. I'm pretty sure that was either entirely written or partially written by those lobbyists on behalf of the Adani group. They want to operate as essentially as a PR rep for a really corrupt foreign businessman that's making billions of dollars, that doesn't really need any more help, that doesn't need US taxpayer help to get there. I'd much rather that they be using that time to address a number of different issues that affect the American people. So yeah, long story short, that's going to wrap up this episode, but I wanted to give you what I think is a pretty pertinent example that really shows the way that money works. in our political system. And again, none of what I was showing you really, none of it's illegal activity. It's just unethical, and that really is the way that our system works. So on that note, again, that's all for this episode. On the business side, I do ask, if you enjoyed this, if you found value from this video, please, if you're listening to it in the podcast form, give it a rating, give it a review. That's what really helps new people to discover this channel. We got to fight through the algorithm there. Tough, independent journalism is not usually pushed to the top there. If you're watching it on YouTube, please give it a like, please subscribe. And if you could, absolutely share this with your friends and help somebody else discover this channel. But on that note, thank you for your time, and until next time.
It's a big club, and you ain't in it.
I am concerned that the size of some of these institutions becomes so large that it does become difficult for us to prosecute.
You can have a license. Price is $250,000, plus a monthly payment of 5% of the gross, of all 4 hotels, Mr. Corleone.